Over the last couple of years, there's been a steady stream of news stories about VPN providers being hacked, the most famous of which being NordVPN, which had one of its servers fully compromised for a whole month, and others like LimeVPN, ChatVPN, PulseSecure, and several others. Today I want to explain to you why most people don't need a VPN and how they do little to protect privacy and security. At the end of the video, I'll give you 3 examples of when you should consider using a VPN. Hello campers and welcome back to the channel. Before we start, I'd like to credit Wolfgang's channel for inspiring this video, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. But instead of rehashing what's already out there, I'd like to expand on some of the really good points that he's already made. So let's get started. VPN providers use scare tactics to persuade you that it's essential to use a VPN, like how you can stop the CIA and the FBI from snooping on your web traffic. You get the idea. But they're promising something that they can't deliver. It's like, oh, I'm fully protected because I've got antivirus, I've got a firewall, I've got a VPN, but at the end of the day, there's no such thing as 100% security or 100% privacy. Hackers can still compromise your device, especially if you don't follow very basic security best practices, like keeping software patched and making sure that you don't use an administrator account for everyday tasks, for example. If you want to protect your privacy completely, don't use the internet. Lock yourself in a bunker, cut yourself off from the world, and make sure you absolutely never write anything down. So what does a VPN actually do? Basically, it routes your traffic using an encrypted tunnel through one of your provider's VPN servers, or very often a rented server. Doing this hides the websites that you're visiting from your ISP, that's your internet service provider, or from your employer, and it changes your IP address. But VPNs don't suddenly improve your security or privacy otherwise. Websites that transfer sensitive information over the internet should already be encrypted by default. You can usually tell by the HTTPS prefix at the beginning of the website's URL. And if those websites are not encrypting your traffic, then you shouldn't be using them. VPN providers often use the insecure Wi-Fi in a coffee shop scare tactic to make you think that you're completely exposed on a public network. And of course, that's not usually the case. And there are plenty of ways that you can be compromised regardless of whether the traffic between you and the web server is encrypted. The VPN provider knows your actual physical IP address, and while many of them claim that they have a no login policy, you have to take their word for it because there's little transparency. And what if a VPN server is located in a legal jurisdiction where they're forced to keep all of the data that flows through their servers and even hand it over if they receive a court order? And in the US, things might be even worse because internet providers are obliged to hand over any information they store about you, and a gagging order might mean that you never get to find out that Uncle Sam is snooping on you. And even if you want to hide your IP address, it's not that difficult to trace you back to a VPN service if you're using a social network like Twitter or Facebook, and that could be used to reveal your identity. So all you're really achieving is moving your internet traffic from one provider to another, neither of which you may be able to trust. You can also attract unwanted attention just by the fact that you're using a VPN service. People often, of course, may be using a VPN service for completely innocent reasons, but other people like journalists, politicians, drug dealers, and hackers all use VPNs to hide their internet activity. Some, of course, for good reason, and others, of course, to hide criminal activity. VPNs also add a level of technical complexity that might outweigh the pros for many people. For instance, there's an overhead on your device because it needs to perform extra cryptography functions, although most modern processors should be able to handle that without breaking a sweat. But one of the biggest issues with the VPNs is that they can slow down your internet throughput, making your connection slower and laggier, compared to if you were just routing your internet traffic through your internet service provider. And if you want to use a VPN service because it provides you with an IP address in a specific location, the many services that use geo-blocking wise up to this, and they block the IP address ranges used by VPN service providers. And of course, this locks you out of the websites that you wanted to access using the VPN. If you're finding this video useful, then please give it a like so that more people get to see it. That would really help me out. And if you'd like to know more about security, backup, productivity, and how to use IT more effectively, then please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell notification so that you don't miss out on my future videos. So if using a VPN provider is not the greatest idea in many cases, what about setting up your own virtual private server? You could set up your own server and use open source VPN software, and that would be much cheaper than paying for a monthly subscription to a service like NordVPN, for example. But most cheap virtual private servers use a system called OpenVZ, which is a container-based Linux virtualization solution. It provides them with a cheap way to provision virtual machines for their customers while passing on the cost savings to you. The problem with this kind of virtualization is that all the virtual private servers on a host share the same kernel, which means if one virtual private server is compromised, then all of the servers are potentially compromised. And even worse, most cheap hosting providers are using an outdated version of OpenVZ, which also uses an old version of the Linux kernel, version 2.6.32 to be precise. And of course, using an out-of-date Linux kernel can also put your virtual private server at risk, of course. It always amuses me how Linux fanboys boast how, because Linux is open source, that the security bugs can be patched faster. That only makes a difference if you actually update your servers on a regular basis, people.
I don't understand.
And believe me, there are many compromised Linux servers out there on the internet, regardless of how secure Linux might be in theory. And because of that shared VPS kernel, these cheap hosting providers can also snoop on all of the network activity flowing through your server and your hard disk. So using them to host your own VPN solution is hardly going to provide you with a more secure or private connection. But if you want a virtual machine in the cloud that uses a more robust and secure system, then you should look at using either KVM, Veeam, or on the Windows side, maybe VMware or Hyper-V. But of course, especially if you're going to use Windows, this is definitely going to cost you more. And while in theory they better protect your data from the provider, it is still possible to, for instance, do something like perform a memory dump, but that's much harder to do. And there are also virtualized solutions that are aimed specifically at organizations that need more security, like a Hyper-V shielded VM, for example. But ultimately, if you decide to host your own VPN service in the cloud, then you need to make sure that the provider is supplying you with a secure and robust solution. You also need to take responsibility for keeping the server secure and up to date, for instance, making sure that the software and that the operating system is kept up to date and that it's secured to best practices. And it's important to note the actual physical location of the virtual server and to make sure that it's not in a country that can potentially just issue a court order to the provider and they would have to hand over all of your data. So despite all of the potentially bad reasons for using a VPN provider or self-hosting your own VPN in a virtual machine in the cloud, there are actually some valid reasons for using a VPN. The first is to use sites that use geo-blocking, with the caveat that sites using geo-blocking will often find out the address range assigned to VPN providers and then block them. But for instance, if you want to watch television in the United States but you're located in Europe, most of those websites are not accessible in Europe because of geo-blocking. But you can use a VPN to provide yourself with an American IP address, and then you can watch content on that website in a European country. The same principle applies to accessing or downloading content that might be blocked by your employer or by your government or by your internet service provider. You might also want to use a VPN to just hide your browsing history from your employer, or maybe if you're located on a public Wi-Fi network. And last but not least, VPNs are often used to access corporate intranets from the public internet. For instance, you might need to use a VPN to access work resources if you're working from home. But some companies are now moving to a zero trust model, where all devices, regardless of who owns them, who is using them, or where they're located, have to pass a series of tests before they gain access to company resources. Organizations can then use an application proxy to give their employees access to internal resources and applications without the employees having to use a VPN connection. So you can keep tech simple by not using a VPN unless you really need to, of course. And this video was sponsored by NordVPN. Just kidding. And if you'd like to know more about how to protect your data if you're using Windows, then have a look at the next video that you can see on the screen, which is about how to protect your data from ransomware. But that's it from me today, and I'll see you next time.